So my question to you is ultimately, how do you surf this enormous tsunami of connections? When I wrote the book, I came up with this title, Cloud Surfing, along with my publisher, because we were actually looking at some videos of folks who do extreme surfing. And I was thinking at the time of how terrifying it must be to ride these waves that are hundreds of feet high. And while we were having that discussion, the tsunami hit Japan, and the catastrophe that ensued caused me to think, you know, if you are able to look at a tsunami coming at you, you have two choices: either get out of the way or be swamped by it. You can't rationalize a tsunami away. You know, as a surfer, when that big wave comes in, you have to ride it. You have no option in the matter. It's either that or get tossed about in the chaos of the surf. So how do you surf the tsunami of connections, what I call hyper-connectivity? And it's not going to be in the way that we think. You see, I think the lens we use to view the world has to change, and it has to change in ways that are going to be very uncomfortable for most of us. If I were to ask you to give me an image of the globe, most of you would think of the blue marble, which is the image that you see here, right? This is the image that was taken from one of the last Apollo moon missions, and it's become sort of an icon, a poster child for the ecological movement, for the whole tremendous push to go green. It's all been driven by this notion of our fragile ecosystem. Well, I think that there's another element to this ecosystem that now we have to begin considering as we try to solve the many problems that we've created over the past several hundred years. And in my estimation, the cloud is very much a part of that. You know, someone asked me a question a number of years ago, and I bring this image up because I'm reminded of that question every time I talk about this. The question was, Tom, when you think of the world, what do you see? What's the image that comes to your mind's eye? And this was not the image that came to my mind's eye, by the way. The image that came to my mind's eye was this image here. It was an image of the map that hung in my grade school classroom, and where it says Russia, my image said the USSR. What an antiquated view of the world, right? Well, my point to all of you is that we tend to develop a lens that frames the way we look at the world, and I think that has to change. You will have to become uncomfortable. You will have to endure disruption in order to fully appreciate the value of the cloud. And while you and I may see that as disruptive and uncomfortable, you know what? There's a bunch of people that don't. You want to guess who those people are? Your kids, my kids, our grandkids, our nieces and nephews. They don't see the discomfort. For them, the cloud is an opportunity. It's a way to change the world and the way they view the world. If you don't believe me, ask this same question of your kids or your grandkids. Ask them, how do you see the world? When you stop and think about the world, what image comes to mind? I do a lot of work in K through 12, and I teach at the undergrad and graduate level. When I ask that question of kids who are under the age of 20, you know what they tell me? Google Earth. That's their view of the world. A world constantly in motion, constantly connected, with no borders that inhibit the progress of thought and our ability to meet virtually any challenge. This is really a platform for innovation. The cloud, in my mind, is going to alter the view of innovation. It's going to change this notion of innovation as invention, the innovation that creates true value, not just more stuff that we can put on our shelves and in our landfill, but value that truly changes business models. And when I think of the cloud, the innovation that I think of mostly is not innovation of product or even innovation of service, but innovation of business model. And I'll show you one business model in just a few minutes that really is going to, I think, tremendously tilt your view of how business will operate over the next 100 years. Remember this fellow, Get Smart? I subscribe to Invention and Technology magazine. Love this magazine. I got an issue of it a few years ago. My daughter, Mia, who at the time was probably 15, saw it on the kitchen table, and she said, Dad, this is not, is this funny? It's not funny to me. I don't get it. And I said, but Mia, he's talking into his shoe. And Mia said to me at that point, but why isn't he just using his cell phone? I said, Mia, we didn't have cell phones back then. You don't get it. He's talking into a shoe. And look, by the way, it's a rotary dial shoe. It's not even a push-button shoe. We get the future wrong, and we get it wrong repeatedly. My question to you is, how can we be so inept at predicting the future? Because the cloud, we've already said, is going to radically change our image of the future in ways that we can't even begin to understand today. So how can we possibly predict it if we have such a bad track record of predicting the future? And it's a very bad one indeed. Did any of you own this Motorola brick cell phone when it first came out? I remember having one. It cost a little over $3,000. You want to guess at what the worldwide projections for the number of cell phones that would be in service by the year 2000 was when the Motorola brick was first introduced? Take a guess. What do you think it was? 10,000? 100,000? 10 million? You know, the consensus, the outside number, by the way, was 100 million, and people thought that was an absolutely absurd number. The consensus was around 10 million. That's 6 zeros, 10 million cell phones enabled by the year 2000. How many cell phones do we have enabled today worldwide? Over 5 billion. We're pushing 6 billion cell phones. We only have 7 billion people on the face of the planet. I mean, this is not a rounding error. Getting from 10 million to nearly 6 billion is not a math error. It's a fundamental inability to predict the future. So I want to caution you on this as we begin to talk today, and we already have, about the notion of the cloud and how it will tip the apple cart and change our view of the world. We are building for the unknown. We're creating organizations, models that we don't necessarily have a value proposition for yet. So when you ask yourself, what's the value of social networking? Why do my kids spend so much time on Facebook and on Skype and texting and messaging? You know what? They couldn't answer that question for you either. As a society, we're not clear on the value. We are building for the unknown, but yet we have this compelling and tremendous drive to connect. And this, I think, has been a fundamental of humanity from the very beginning of civilization. What we're doing is accelerating those connections, accelerating them not just between people, as we said, but between people and machines to machines. And what does that do? It enables us to cope with uncertainty. This is a very important principle. I think that fundamentally the role of the cloud is to help us to cope with increasing levels of uncertainty. So what you see here is that as the velocity of opportunity, which equates to the degree of uncertainty in a market, right? As you have more uncertainty, you have more opportunity. The problem is that each opportunity lasts for a shorter and shorter duration of time. This curve you see from the upper left to the lower right of your screen. So you have to react faster and faster. That's tedious. That's frustrating. We don't like that, but we have to do it. So what do? We rely on technology to help us react faster. But technology is also adding something to our plate, isn't it? It's adding more and more data. And I love to talk about this because, you know, I grew up, when I entered the high-tech field, we were still talking in terms of kilobytes. And then we went to megabytes. And from megabytes, we went to gigabytes. And then we went to terabytes and petabytes. What comes after this? Does it really matter? Does it really matter? Do we have to measure the amount of data anymore? And the answer is, of course not. The reality is that for all intents and purposes, we will be dealing with an infinite pool of data. How does that impact the time to react? You see, my premise is that without the cloud, without this intensely hyper-connected community, we simply will be frozen and paralyzed. We will not be able to make decisions. We will not be able to analyze the information presented to us, and we will quickly succumb to it. The cloud is the antidote to much of this, and it is the answer to how do we deal with uncertainty. But you know what's funny is that most of us don't really know what uncertainty is. I remember talking with my late Peter Drucker, my mentor and friend for many, many years, and asking him about this notion of uncertainty, and he said to me, he said, Tom, this is, in fact, something that has been studied a great deal in economics. And the problem with uncertainty is that you can't price it into most business models. I would go further and say the problem with uncertainty is that we can't price it into our lives. We have a fundamental problem with uncertainty. So if I were to ask you, what's a game of uncertainty, what would you come back with? Probably, you know, maybe chess or poker or a game of dice, a game you might play in a casino. Guess what? None of those are games of uncertainty. These are all games of probability. Uncertainty is when you break the rules. You want a game of uncertainty? Play chess with a 3-year-old, where the king can leave the board, go into the other room, and not come back until you decide that you're going to finally hand the game over to your opponent. That's a game of uncertainty. Why? Because the rules are defined by your opponent. That's what we don't like about uncertainty, and that so describes the world we live in today, a world in which the rules are constantly being broken. So along comes big data to help us with pattern recognition to better understand this information. Here's the problem with big data, the way I see it being applied today. And it's part of what we have to do to build the right foundation for the cloud. If we have established patterns that we're accustomed to using when we perceive the marketplace, perceive our competition, perceive the trends in the political or economic space, then we cause the data to conform to those patterns. And that is reinforcing the past. It is not enabling us to navigate the future. The disruption I talk about when I talk about the disruption in the cloud, and I talk about this extensively in the book, is not just disruption in terms of more data. It's disruption in terms of being able to tie that data together in ways that we could not have anticipated. And by doing that, creating business models that are much better, and not just predicting, but surviving the uncertainty of the future. And, you know, we've seen this play out. This is not a new story. It's a story that we've heard over and over again. I grew up with the first transistor radio, which you see here in the lower right. I grew up with the Walkman, as many of you did, which you see front and center. And, of course, I'm now growing up with my personal device, the soundtrack of my life, my MP3 player, my iPod. I can't live without this device. It's become part of my very existence. But you know, when Akio Morita and Sony first introduced the transistor radio, they had strong doubts that this would ever be a popular product. And yet Sony, over the course of several decades, acquired the entire music industry. By the time they had the Walkman, they owned the artists, they owned the studios, they owned every aspect of the music industry. And yet what happened? Along came a complete outsider, Apple, and took that away from them. Now, I talk in the book at length about how this all came about and some of the tremendous difficulties and challenges that incumbents like Sony face. But the reality is that what Apple did is exceptionally important to this notion of how we innovate. Apple created what I call third and fourth derivative cloud-based innovation. And here's how this works. Bear with me while we talk through this for just a minute. The first derivative of innovation focuses on the device. And Sony understood this. They knew this well. Most device-based innovation is first derivative. Second derivative innovation starts to incorporate some of the data with the device. So as we began to see MP3 become more of a standard and digital music start to make more of a presence, as Napster began to threaten the music industry, we began to see data and device combined. Well, that's a very tumultuous period typically. There are a few standards, a lot of threats, and the incumbents here are running for their lives. They don't know what to do to accommodate the new model, which is yet to define itself. At this point, typically, along comes a third derivative innovator. And this was the model that ultimately Apple capitalized on. Not just the device, which was beautiful, designed extraordinarily well, a gorgeous piece of artwork, a tremendous functionality, but it also combined the data and ultimately the experience with the device. In the cloud, most innovation that we'll see is of this third and fourth derivative form. In fact, I speculate that we will even see a fifth derivative emerge, where markets will begin to innovate themselves. And I know that's difficult to believe right now, but I'm going to show you some examples of this in just a few minutes. So I showed you earlier the picture of Ed White when I talked about building for the unknown. Ed White was the U.S. astronaut, was the first U.S. astronaut to walk in space. What you see now looks a bit like a diving suit, doesn't it? It's not. It's the first suit that was used by pilots when their planes could exceed the G-forces of post-World War II aviation. This was actually a flight suit, believe it or not, and it was meant to pump all the blood that rushed to their extremities back up into their brain. It's a very odd-looking suit, isn't it? In many ways, I put it up here because it reminds me of the way that we're trying today to navigate the cloud. We feel overwhelmed, too much data, too much social networking, too many connections that we have to manage, and yet we know that somehow we have to come to grips with all this. We have to be able to sustain the G-forces. And it's getting bad very, very quickly. This is a chart that I came across some years ago, and I tracked it over time. If you look at the use of telecommunications, standard telecommunications, voice communications, back in 1982, a typical phone call used to last for 10 minutes. Today, less than a minute, and you've noticed this. You're constantly getting on and off the phone, multiple phone calls going at the same time. However, in 1982, we only billed for 1 billion minutes globally. Today, we're billing for 100 billion, and that does not include the 100 billion over Skype. That does not include the additional 200 billion over all other voice over IP capabilities that we have available to us as well. The acceleration, my point is here, is absolutely extraordinary and nothing that we could have predicted. And we see it on our desktops, don't we? There's this tremendous frustration that we have with slicing our lives into thinner and thinner segments. How many windows do you have open right now on your desktop? How many open windows do you have typically when you're working in a complex situation? My laptop always has at least 20 windows open, and I can never have enough real estate, no matter how big the screen is, to accommodate all those different pieces of data, those different processes. Life is necessarily complex. So along comes the cloud and changes this. And it creates what I call an infrastructure of everything as a service, not just information and applications and software, but everything, including you and I, become part of the service. And this is the business model I was alluding to earlier. The business model that I see emerging from the cloud is one that is purely behavioral. I call it trading on behavior. It's a new era that really is going to create businesses that are predictive, are able to see into the future and build products, services, capabilities, experiences that we as consumers wouldn't even know to ask for. Now, I know that sounds very far-fetched, but the future is only the future when it becomes uncomfortable to understand and difficult to perceive in the present, in the current moment. This behavioral business model is the reason Facebook and Google exist. I recently did an article for a fast company where I talk about this extensively. You know, the behavioral business model is, I think, the model that every business will have to adapt to going forward. And when you connect big data with this behavioral business model, what you get ultimately through all these connections is a form of intelligence that will begin to shape markets and social institutions. To give you some perspective here, what that will do is take us from this lower left-hand quadrant of mass production where it was any color as long as it's black, right? You knew the supply chain, you knew the demand chain. You didn't ask folks what color automobile they wanted. You just gave them the automobile because you knew that they would buy it. And from there, we moved to this notion of mass customization where we would start to build to suit the customer. Here the supply chain was not as well known because we had to reform those partnerships in order to create new capabilities for customer requirements. But we could sense those customer requirements. We did focus groups. We did things that were very sophisticated back in this age to help us better identify the market. But the market became more complex. And over time, we built great supply chains. We become masters at the supply chain. But the market began to move so quickly that we couldn't predict where it was going to go. This is mass personalization. Right? This is the era where everything is built for a customer, a marketplace of one. But where are we ultimately going with the cloud? We're going into a situation where we don't really know what the future configuration of the supply chain or the demand chain will look like. That is a model that I refer to as mass innovation. And it's being done today. I've got a number of companies I talk about in the book, just two here that you should be aware of. E2Open, fantastic company that is creating what they call control towers that look over marketplaces and aggregate all the behaviors across a marketplace, and as a result, actually predict new products and services and experiences that that marketplace needs, that it wouldn't know to ask for. If you were to go to the customers, they wouldn't know to ask for this. But E2Open can, through its control towers and its ability to analyze trends in real time, actually predict the emergence of new markets. GSX is doing this as well. There are other companies that you are very familiar with, such as GM with OnStar. You know, today, if you have OnStar in your car, GM knows your driving behavior. If you're in an accident, they can take that behavioral data. They can take information about the scene of the accident, the weather conditions at the accident, empirical data about prior accidents that have the same forces involved in the accident, the same sort of accelerations involved in the accident. They can take all of that and they can determine what kinds of injuries empirically you might have. And as a result of that, actually route you and the first responders to the most appropriate trauma center. This is the cloud in real time, helping to change fundamentally the way that we operate. And it's something that we quickly are going to become more and more dependent on. Last couple of things before we go to Q&A. All of this is global. And I really think that the true advance of our generation that we've seen during my lifetime, certainly, is that we've stopped moving people and we've begun to focus on moving the work to wherever the people are. Location no longer matters. But along with that, this is not a new thing, right? You know this. But along with that, I've got a question of you. When we ultimately do reach 10 billion people, let's say we could educate every single one of them, because today, MIT, Stanford, a lot of universities and colleges are going open source and providing all their content online. When we can finally educate 10 billion people, what will that marketplace look like? What will that world be able to deal with in terms of challenges and problems that are thrown at it? And by the way, let's not be Pollyannish about this. Who's going to own the 100 billion additional sensors that track the behavior of those 10 billion people? And 100 billion, I think I'm being very conservative. It is a different world, isn't it? A much more complex one than anything that we've grown up with, and may indeed be more complex than anything we can project. The last point, all this is not being done with a generation that sees their role as being that of an individual contributor. The future for kids today is not a solo flight. The reality is that these kids are growing up in an era where everything is collaborative. The way they play, the way that they socialize is all based on intense hyper-connectivity. I did some research on the Nobel Prizes and how they were awarded over the last century, and it was interesting to me, I found that during the first half of the last century, 1900 1950, the Nobels in the physical sciences were awarded predominantly to individuals, and very few were awarded to teams. In the second half of the last century, it was an even split between teams and individuals. I would predict that in the first half of this century, and certainly by the time the century is out, we will not see any Nobels awarded to individuals. Not because, and this is the conventional wisdom, not because problems are too complex, they certainly are, but because this generation will never have become accustomed to being alone. In the cloud, you are never alone. You never develop that tremendous sense of solitude that most of us have grown up with at times in our lives. You are always connected. My daughter sleeps with her laptop. I will make a confession, my cell phone, my smartphone is never beyond arm's reach, even when I go to bed. I mean, is the first thing you do in the morning to check your email? It's probably the second thing if it's not the first. We have all become accustomed to and expect this hyperconnectivity. My son Adam was only 13. He doesn't play with Legos like this anymore. For him, playing with Legos is a social experience. I could run a short movie for you here, and I only have a static image, unfortunately, to show you. But he'll get on and use this equivalent of a CAD system when he's playing with Legos to build his devices, and he'll spend hours and hours doing this, and he loves to share his creations with others and loves to have them build on it. He doesn't care about the IP. This doesn't belong to him. It's not his toy. It's the toy of his community. And he loves that interaction, whether he's wargaming or playing with Legos online with Lego Factory, as you see here. And as a parent, my goodness, I don't know what to do about this. Maybe you're in the same predicament that I am. The reality is, I'm not sure how long is too long to spend on a computer. What I do know is that Adam is creating what he calls his own virtual cul-de-sac. And he actually calls it that. I talked to him one day. I said, Adam, you've got to get off the video games and go watch some TV. Do something else, please. Bad parental advice. I would not ask that you follow that. It's not a good example to set, I guess. Adam turned around and said to me, Dad, when you grew up, did you go out and play? I said, of course I did, Adam. I went out and I rode my bike and I played with other kids. He said, did you live on a cul-de-sac? I said, well, it wasn't called a cul-de-sac. It was called a dead end, but yeah, sort of. He said, Dad, you don't get it. The Internet is my cul-de-sac. This is where my friends are. This is where I want to be. Tough to parent. And for these kids, man, if you plot work-life expectancy against one another, how long we're working versus how long we're going to live, these kids are going to be working after they're dead. And this sounds funny, but it's not. This is true. There's a whole industry being built. When I talk about these companies that are building an industry around the notion of preserving a social network after you're long gone. It's a funny quirk in the book. I talk about it a great deal. But you know what? It's a very meaningful part of the cloud that it will allow us to somehow continue to be contributors even when we're no longer alive. Odd? Absolutely. Let me leave you with one last thought. I talked at the beginning about predicting. Don't ever be so sure in your ability to predict that you refuse to take a detour when you run head-on into reality, which we often do when change is so accelerated as it is today. So who said this? Everything that can be invented has been invented. Supremely arrogant statement, isn't it? Charles Dewey, Commissioner of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, 1899. What is about to come is going to surprise us all. In the book, I talk not just about computing, but about the social, the economic, the global changes that are going to occur that I think are going to create a world of much higher reliance, a world of much higher prosperity, and a world that's able to take on virtually any challenge. It's an exciting opportunity, I think, for those of us that are willing to live through the disruption, the frustration, and the temporary discomfort that's going to come with cloud surfing. Melissa, with that, I'll turn it back over to you, and then I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom. I'm going to switch it back over right now. I'll just take one moment. Thank you again, Tom, so much for sharing your insights with us today. Here's his contact information if you'd like to get in touch with him. And now, before we start the Q&A, I have just a few reminders. Just to remind you once more, we're having a survey online. If you'd like to participate, you'll be entered into a drawing for a chance to receive Tom's book, Cloud Surfing. And for those who joined us later in the session, please feel free to visit our blog and join our Facebook and LinkedIn groups to stay updated on future events. And we'll also be posting a recording of the session today on those groups on Facebook and LinkedIn. These are our special offers for August. We have several packs available for $20. And you'll be receiving these slides too, so you can have a refresher on these. But if you'd like to go to that URL, peopleonthego.com/specials, they are there for you. And so now we are at the Q&A portion of our presentation. And at this time, I'd like to invite you to please type your questions in the panel on the right-hand side, and I'm going to relay them to Tom.
Hey, Melissa, that stress management package might be a good accompaniment for some of the dynamics I talked about coming with the cloud.
I think that that's a great suggestion, Tom. The future can be a stressful place.
It seems to be getting more and more stressful with every day that goes by.
Indeed. While we wait for some questions, Tom, are there any points that you'd like to follow up on?
Yeah, one of the things that might be interesting for folks to consider, and it's usually the case after I turn on the fire hose that it's tough to sneak a question in with everything that I've covered. But a couple of points that I think are really worth bringing to the surface here. One of them is the generational difference that I talked about. You know, it's going to be incredibly interesting to see how 4 or 5 generations, because we're all going to work longer, we'll all be in the workforce longer, and these kids are coming into the workforce earlier and earlier. It's going to be fun to see how 4 or 5 generations work together, because a lot of these kids simply will not accept the view of technology or the view of collaboration that many of us already in the workforce have, and they want to be disruptive. They almost expect to be disruptive. And I was talking to some of these kids at a recent Cisco event. Cisco calls them their millennial fellows. They have a bunch of young kids. And one of them was a Harvard dropout who left Harvard after her second year in Harvard and said, you know what, Harvard's just not teaching me anything. I'm not getting anything out of it, so I'm going to leave and go off and start my own businesses. And she did. These kids won't tolerate bad behavior on the part of management. They won't tolerate social institutions that don't deliver on their promise. And as a result, they'll mount their own little Arab Spring within a company, and they think nothing of exerting their power that way. That's a very disruptive thing in any organizational setting, and I wonder if folks are seeing that already and how they're coping with that. And the second is everyone's skipped to death about security in the cloud. You know, putting my wallet in the cloud, which is what Google is doing now for us. Putting my identity in the cloud. In the near term, there's a lot of concern around that. And I'd be curious as to what people's thoughts are about both of those generational issues and those security issues.
Right. We actually did have a question. How do we best teach seniors about this concept?
What a great question. You know, just yesterday, my dad is in his 70s and late 70s, and just yesterday I taught him how to text for the first time. Now, this is a fellow who is a brilliant man. He had invented tremendous technologies in the early days of computing, and he had never actually texted. And I asked him why. He just, I just never had the need to. But now I want to text because I want to text, to my grandkids, and they won't respond to a phone call. He was a bit irate because he was calling my kids, his grandkids, and they wouldn't return his calls because one didn't use voicemail at all, and the other had a full voicemail box every time he'd call her. I said, Dad, you have to text them. He said, well, help me text. I think part of how we bring them in is through necessity. It's something that you have to do to be part of the community, and the value, and they see it very quickly. It is the instantaneous nature of these communication tools. You're not waiting for someone to call you back. You get an immediate response. I mean, we're so accustomed to being 24/7 on all the time. And I think in some ways that's a tremendous value proposition. It does make it difficult. I mean, if you're used to working at a different pace, that can be awfully frustrating to change that pace at which you communicate. But the reality is, if you want to be part of the conversation, you have to. And I think that's what's going to drive a lot of the folks who are older, kind of beyond that threshold of pain to finally invest of themselves and try to figure out how they can make it work so that they can stay plugged into their community, their social network, in the very broad sense of the word.
Right. Regarding security, we have a question. Do any financial companies use the cloud? It seems that regulatory issues would be difficult to work with, as well as security issues.
Yeah, so I didn't get into the different forms of cloud, and one of the things that's very important to understand is that when we say the cloud, we're talking in very broad terms. For a financial services firm, for a healthcare concern or a healthcare provider or an insurance company, there's a lot of regulation associated with what they can and cannot share. There's a lot of regulation associated with how they can protect and express their fiduciary responsibilities over client information. And for those companies, there are what are called private clouds, which are clouds that are highly secured, are in many cases owned by the organization or are sourced in such a way that it's a private data center, a private set of hardware and computing resources that are being used. And those can overcome some of those problems. A lot of times when we say about cloud, people believe that there's a single amorphous cloud floating over the entire globe and everything goes into that cloud. We're certainly not there yet. But I want to point out something which often is lost in the security conversation. We think we're secure today, and we're kind of holding the cloud up against this artificial and mythological benchmark of 100% security. We're not secure today. You know, I'm constantly in fear that I will lose my laptop. I back it up. It's backed up, you know, throughout the day. I mean, my stuff is in a secured cloud as well. But I never want to lose my laptop because I know there's stuff on there that I just don't want someone else to get their hands on. And at LAX, I talk about this in the book at Los Angeles International Airport. There are thousands upon thousands of laptops that are lost every single week. The last number I saw was in excess of 10,000 laptops every single week. Where's the security there? I mean, there is none. So we have to be very careful. We certainly want to strive towards a much higher level of security than what we have today. We are not secure today. The cloud at least gives us an ability to monitor threats, to stop the breach before it happens. And this is the kind of security that I think we need to have in place, but so many of us do not. And so much of the U.S. economy is based on small and medium-sized business. You know, the last number I saw, less than half of small and medium-sized business even back up their corporate computing infrastructure. Again, where's the security? It's not there. So let's not be naive about this. We're trying to measure the cloud against something which doesn't exist. So we want to make strides forward. We want to become more secure. I think the cloud allows us to monitor and be much more diligent in how we manage security issues. But we're hardly at 100% security at the present time. We're very, very vulnerable. I think the cloud in many ways helps us with that. All that said, I have no doubt in my mind that the cloud will be a battlefield. There will be terrorism and cyber war fought in the cloud. We're already seeing this happening, the early stages of this happening. So let's not fool ourselves. It will certainly be a battlefield in the future, which is all the more reason to be diligent and to make sure that we make this a very important part of the conversation about how we shape and create the cloud that we're talking about.
Great, thank you for that, Tom. We've gone a little bit over time. I have a couple more questions here. I think we'll get to this one, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up, and I'll answer some of the other more housekeeping-related questions about showing the survey link again. Here's this final question, and this sort of goes back to teaching the older generation, or just really anyone in general who's new to the cloud. Do you have a simple way to define the cloud for those who really don't have any context?
Yeah, the cloud is the simplest way to define it, and it's not a technology way to define it. So I preface that because it's important to understand that my view of the cloud includes much, much more than a technology. My definition of the cloud is that it is the new context within which we will conduct our social, political, and economic institutions. So this becomes a platform for change. It is the way that we will connect. It is the way that we will communicate. It is the way that we will conduct commerce. And that, for me, is the broadest possible way to look at the cloud and the sort of impact it will have on virtually every aspect of how we work, live, and play.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tom. Once again, here is the link to the survey where you can, for a chance to win a copy of Tom's book. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for sticking around and asking questions. And thank you, Tom, once again for your presentation. The recording will be available on the Facebook and LinkedIn groups. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to contact us or Tom. I'm going to be ending the session now, and have a great rest of your day.